Hello, friends. Welcome back to another new story. How absolute power worked in ancient Egypt. Long before crowns were forged and kings were carved into stone, ancient Egypt was already being shaped by forces stronger than any ruler. The Nile that decided life or death, the deserts that trapped people together, and a belief that order itself was sacred. From this land emerged a system where survival required obedience, where the river fed those who complied, and where power slowly transformed from leadership into divinity. Long before crowns were forged from gold, and before names of kings were carved into stone, the land that would become ancient Egypt was already shaping the destiny of power. Absolute rule in Egypt did not begin with a single man declaring himself supreme. It was born slowly, almost inevitably, from the land itself, from the river that gave life, from the deserts that isolated it, and from the deep human need for order in an unpredictable world. Egypt was never an easy place to live. To the east and west stretched vast deserts, hostile, dry, and deadly. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea, unpredictable and difficult to navigate in early times. To the south, rocky cataracts broke the flow of the great river. In the middle of all this ran the Nile, a narrow ribbon of water cutting through lifeless sand. This geography did something extraordinary. It trapped people together. Communities could not easily migrate away when things became difficult. They could not spread outward into fertile lands as people did in Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley. Instead, they clustered tightly along the Nile's banks, dependent on the same water, the same soil, and the same seasonal rhythms. Survival required cooperation, coordination, and eventually centralized control. From the very beginning, Egypt was a land that punished division and rewarded unity. The Nile was not just a river, it was a godlike force. Every year its waters rose and flooded the fields, depositing rich black silt that made agriculture possible. When the floods were good, there was abundance. When they failed, there was hunger, chaos, and death. No individual farmer could control this cycle. No village could predict it accurately on its own. Understanding the Nile required observation over generations, record-keeping, and coordination across large distances. This need gave rise to specialists, men who measured water levels, tracked seasons, and interpreted signs. Knowledge became power. Those who claimed to understand the Nile, why it flooded, when it would recede, and how to please the forces behind it, naturally rose above others. Over time, this knowledge stopped being shared freely. It became guarded, ritualized, and tied to authority. If survival depended on the Nile, and the Nile depended on the gods, then those closest to the gods deserved obedience. Thus, the roots of absolute power were planted not through violence, but through dependency. In the earliest periods, Egypt was made up of small farming villages. Each community had elders, leaders, and local traditions, but as populations grew, conflicts emerged over water access, land boundaries, and grain storage. Simple leadership was no longer enough. Villages began forming alliances. Alliances turned into regional powers. These regions, known later as nomes, developed their own symbols, patron gods, and ruling families. Competition between them was inevitable, but so was consolidation. Over time, two major regions emerged: Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. They were different in culture, symbols, and political traditions, but both depended on the same river. Control of the Nile meant control of life itself, and whoever controlled the entire river would control the future. The struggle between these regions was not just political, it was existential. When one ruler finally unified Upper and Lower Egypt, something unprecedented occurred. For the first time, a single individual claimed authority over the entire length of the Nile. This was not merely conquest, it was transformation. The king was no longer just a war leader. He became the embodiment of unity itself. To rule such a vast and varied land, force alone was insufficient. The ruler needed legitimacy, something deeper than fear. That legitimacy came from religion. The king was declared chosen by the gods, later seen as divine himself, responsible for maintaining harmony between heaven, earth, and the river. Obedience was no longer a political act. It became a sacred duty. Unlike societies that celebrated debate or shared rule, early Egypt valued stability above all else. Life depended on predictability. Predictable floods, predictable seasons, predictable authority. Chaos, whether natural or political, meant death. This mindset shaped Egyptian thinking for thousands of years. A strong ruler who maintained order was preferable to many leaders arguing among themselves. Absolute power was not feared. It was welcomed. People did not ask whether the ruler had the right to command. They asked whether he could keep the Nile flowing, the granaries full, and the gods satisfied. In this environment, resistance was not just rebellion. It was an attack on cosmic balance. As early kings expanded their control, they faced a problem: how to rule without being everywhere. The solution was administration. Officials were appointed to oversee land, collect grain, organize labor, and enforce royal decisions. These men answered only to the king. Records were kept, taxes were standardized, labor was organized on a massive scale. Farmers owed grain not just to survive winter, but to serve the state. In return, the state promised protection, stability, and divine favor. This system was not temporary. It became permanent. The ruler stood at the top, but beneath him spread a vast structure of power that touched every field and household. Absolute authority was no longer personal. It was systemic. Egypt's environment reinforced obedience in subtle ways. The daily journey of the sun across the sky, its disappearance and rebirth each morning, mirrored the ruler's promise of eternal order. The unchanging desert symbolized permanence. The steady flow of the Nile reinforced the idea that the world worked best when everything stayed in its proper place. Change was dangerous. Tradition was safety. This worldview made the concept of a permanent, unquestioned ruler not only acceptable, but logical. If the universe itself followed order, why shouldn't society? By the time Egypt entered its earliest dynasties, absolute rule was no longer an experiment. It was an expectation. The king was the axis around which life turned. His authority reached into religion, law, agriculture, and time itself, as years were counted by his reign. What began as cooperation became control. What began as leadership became divinity. And yet, to the people living along the Nile, this system did not feel oppressive. It felt necessary. Absolute power in Egypt was not seized in a single moment. It was grown season by season, flood by flood, generation by generation, until it seemed as natural and eternal as the river itself. To understand absolute power in ancient Egypt, one must understand a paradox that defined the civilization for more than 3,000 years. The pharaoh was both human and divine. He ate, slept, aged, and died like any other man. Yet he was also believed to be a god walking among mortals, the living bridge between heaven and earth. This belief was not symbolic or poetic. It was real, deeply embedded in every ritual, law, and act of obedience. The divinity of the pharaoh was not merely an idea. It was the foundation upon which Egypt stood. In most ancient societies, gods were distant. They lived in the sky, the underworld, or beyond the reach of human hands. In Egypt, however, divinity had a face, a voice, and a throne. The pharaoh was not simply chosen by the gods. He was divine by nature. From the moment of his coronation, the ruler ceased to be an ordinary man. His body was believed to house divine essence. His words carried sacred authority. His actions were thought to shape the balance of the universe itself. To obey the pharaoh was not loyalty, it was worship. This belief transformed politics into religion, and religion into law. The idea of a god-king did not emerge suddenly. It evolved from earlier traditions where chiefs and kings were seen as favored by supernatural forces. Over time, this favor became identity. The ruler was no longer protected by the gods. He was one of them. This concept solved a fundamental problem of early statehood: legitimacy. In a land dependent on order, stability, and coordination, questioning authority could be disastrous. Declaring the king divine removed the question entirely. One does not argue with a god. One obeys. Divine kingship turned power into destiny. Egyptian belief held that the universe functioned according to a delicate balance between chaos and order, life and death, gods and humans. This balance did not maintain itself. It required constant care. That responsibility fell on the pharaoh. He was believed to uphold cosmic order through rituals, offerings, laws, and warfare. If floods failed, if famine struck, or if enemies invaded, it was not nature or chance. It was a sign that the balance had been disturbed. The pharaoh's duty was to restore it. Thus, his authority extended beyond politics. He was responsible for the movement of the stars, the rising of the sun, and the rhythm of the Nile. His success or failure affected every living thing. In this system, obedience was not enforced primarily through fear. It was enforced through belief. To obey the pharaoh was to participate in the maintenance of cosmic order. To disobey him was to invite chaos, not only into society, but into the universe itself. This belief shaped behavior at every level of life. Farmers paid taxes not just because they were demanded, but because refusal threatened divine balance. Officials enforced laws not merely to maintain order, but to serve a sacred mission. Even punishment was framed as restoration, not cruelty. Rebellion was more than treason. It was sacrilege. Despite his divinity, the pharaoh remained visibly human, and this was crucial. He appeared in public ceremonies, led festivals, hunted and presided over courts. His humanity made him relatable. His divinity made him unquestionable. This dual nature strengthened obedience. People could see him, hear him, and imagine him as a father, protector, and judge, while still fearing his divine power. The pharaoh was close enough to touch, yet too sacred to challenge. Power became personal and eternal at the same time. Every aspect of royal life was ritualized to reinforce divinity. Coronations were not political events. They were sacred transformations. Clothing, crowns, symbols, and gestures were all carefully chosen to reflect cosmic truths. The pharaoh wore specific crowns to represent unity. He held symbols that signified control over life and death. His names carried divine meanings. Even his daily routine followed sacred patterns, aligning his body with the rhythms of the cosmos. Through constant repetition, divinity became unquestioned reality. Because the pharaoh was divine, his authority had no legal boundary. There was no constitution, no parliament, no written limitation on royal power. The law existed, but it flowed from the king. Judges ruled in his name. Officials carried out his will. Even when laws appeared stable and traditional, they were ultimately expressions of royal authority. Justice was not blind, it was sacred. This did not mean constant tyranny. In fact, most pharaohs ruled through tradition rather than cruelty. But the absence of limits meant that mercy and punishment were both gifts of divine will. Unlike ordinary men, the pharaoh's death was not seen as an end. It was a transformation. His body died, but his divine essence lived on among the gods. From there, he continued to influence the living world. This belief had enormous political consequences. The dead pharaoh was still powerful. His successor ruled not in opposition to him, but as his heir and continuation. Loyalty extended across generations. Monuments, tombs, and temples were not memorials. They were engines of eternal authority. It is tempting to think this system was imposed through manipulation, but belief in the pharaoh's divinity was genuine. The natural world seemed to confirm it. The Nile flooded, the sun rose, seasons continued. As long as order remained, the system worked. When disasters occurred, the solution was not revolution. It was ritual. More offerings, more prayers, more obedience. Faith stabilized power more effectively than force ever could. By transforming a man into a god, Egypt solved the problem of absolute power. Authority no longer needed justification. It simply was. The pharaoh stood beyond criticism, beyond law, beyond time. This belief created one of the most stable political systems in human history. Dynasties rose and fell, but the idea of divine kingship endured. Even foreign rulers adopted it. Even conquerors bowed to it. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler of Egypt. He was Egypt, and as long as people believed that a god walked among them, wearing a crown, speaking judgments, and commanding the land, absolute power did not feel like oppression. Long before medieval kings in Europe claimed to rule by the divine right of kings, ancient Egypt had already perfected the idea. In Egypt, political authority did not borrow power from religion. It was built from it. The state did not stand beside belief. It stood inside belief. Law, leadership, obedience, and faith were inseparable threads woven into a single system. To understand how Egypt sustained absolute power for millennia, one must look not at armies or laws, but at temples, rituals, and gods. Religion was not a tool used by the state. It was the ground on which the state was built. To the ancient Egyptian mind, the universe was alive with divine forces. Every natural event, the rising sun, the flooding river, the desert wind, was an expression of godly will. Nothing happened by chance. Everything had meaning, intention, and purpose. In such a world, authority could not be secular. A ruler who governed without divine sanction would be as unnatural as a river flowing uphill. Power had to reflect the structure of the cosmos itself. Thus, political authority was not justified through conquest or popularity, but through alignment with the divine order. The ruler was powerful because the gods made him so, and because the world itself confirmed it. In Egypt, law did not originate from human debate or written constitutions. It originated from the gods. Justice, truth, and order were believed to be divine principles embedded into creation. Humans did not invent them, they obeyed them. This belief had profound consequences. Laws were not negotiable because divine truth was not negotiable. To challenge authority was not to challenge a policy, it was to challenge the will of the gods. The ruler stood at the center of this system, acting as the interpreter and enforcer of divine principles. His commands were not opinions. They were sacred declarations. Temples in ancient Egypt were not simply places of worship. They were economic, political, and administrative centers. Vast tracts of land, herds of animals, storehouses of grain, and armies of workers belonged to the gods, and by extension, to those who served them. Priests managed these resources, but they did so in the name of divine authority and royal approval. The boundary between religious and political leadership was deliberately blurred. The same structure that honored the gods also sustained the state. When the ruler funded temples, expanded them, or endowed them with land, he was not losing power, he was reinforcing it. Supporting the gods meant supporting the system that legitimized his rule. Religion in Egypt was not passive belief, it was constant action. Daily rituals were performed to maintain the balance of the universe. Offerings were made. Hymns were sung. Sacred words were spoken with precise movements and timing. The ruler played a central role in these rituals. Even when priests acted on his behalf, they did so as his representatives. Every successful ritual confirmed that the ruler was fulfilling his sacred duty. Every sunrise was proof that the system worked, as long as rituals continued and order remained. Political authority remained unquestioned. The greatest fear in Egyptian thought was not tyranny, it was chaos. Chaos meant famine, invasion, disease, and the collapse of the universe itself. Religion taught that chaos was always waiting, pressing against the fragile walls of order. The ruler's role was to hold chaos back. This belief created powerful psychological obedience. People did not follow authority merely because they were told to. They followed because disobedience threatened everything they loved. Stability was sacred, change was dangerous. In this way, religion made political obedience feel like self-preservation. Egyptian morality was not based on individual rights or personal freedom. It was based on fulfilling one's role within the divine order. A good person was one who obeyed, respected hierarchy, and upheld tradition. The ruler was the highest moral authority, not because he was morally perfect, but because he embodied the divine structure of the world. Serving him was virtuous, defying him was sinful. This moral framework made resistance rare and socially condemned. Even victims of injustice were encouraged to endure rather than disrupt order. No system is perfect, and Egypt was no exception. Floods sometimes failed, crops failed, plagues struck, yet these disasters did not undermine political authority. Religion absorbed them. Suffering was explained as divine displeasure, imbalance, or temporary disorder, not as failure of leadership. The solution was not rebellion, but repentance, ritual, and renewed obedience. This belief protected the state from collapse. Where other societies might turn against their rulers in times of crisis, Egyptians turned inward, seeking spiritual correction. Priests held enormous influence, but they never replaced the ruler. Religion allowed power to be shared administratively while remaining centralized symbolically. Priests could advise, manage, and interpret divine will, but ultimate authority always rested with the ruler. He alone stood at the intersection of gods and people. Even powerful religious figures derived legitimacy from their connection to him. This balance prevented religious institutions from overthrowing political authority, while still making them essential to governance. Religion also shaped how Egyptians understood time. History was not viewed as progress or revolution, but as repetition. The same patterns had always existed and always would. By embedding political authority into eternal religious cycles, the state made itself feel timeless. Change became abnormal, innovation became suspicious, tradition became sacred. A system that feels eternal does not need constant enforcement. People enforce it themselves. Religion succeeded where force alone could not. Armies can conquer, but belief sustains. Egypt's rulers understood, perhaps instinctively, that power rooted in faith is stronger than power rooted in fear. As long as people believed the gods governed the world, and as long as the ruler stood as their chosen guardian, absolute authority felt natural, even comforting. This was divine right before it had a name. Not a philosophy written by scholars, but a lived reality shaped by ritual, fear, hope, and faith. Religion did not merely support political authority in ancient Egypt. It created it. In ancient Egypt, power did not rest solely on force, fear, or even divine kingship. Beneath the throne, beneath the temples, and beneath the gods themselves lay a single, all-encompassing principle that shaped every aspect of life: Ma'at. It was more than a goddess, more than a moral idea, and more than a law. Ma'at was the invisible structure of reality itself, the force that held the universe together. And in the name of Ma'at, absolute obedience was not only justified, but demanded. To live in Egypt was to live inside Ma'at. To obey authority was to protect it. To resist was to threaten the cosmos. Ma'at represented order, in a universe constantly threatened by chaos. It was truth instead of lies, balance instead of excess, stability instead of disorder. The Egyptians believed that when the world was created, Ma'at was woven into existence at its foundation. Without it, the sun would not rise, the Nile would not flood, and life would collapse into darkness. This belief turned order into a sacred necessity. Order was not a human preference, it was a cosmic requirement. Every act, from farming to governing, had to align with Ma'at or risk unraveling reality itself. In such a worldview, obedience was not submission. It was participation in survival. Opposed to Ma'at was chaos, unpredictable, violent, and destructive. Chaos was associated with darkness, foreign lands, rebellion, lies, and disorder. It was everything that threatened stability. Importantly, chaos was not imaginary. The desert storms, failed floods, invasions, and internal unrest were seen as signs of its presence. Chaos was always near, always waiting. The role of authority, especially absolute authority, was to keep chaos at bay. Strong leadership was not a luxury. It was a defense against annihilation. The Pharaoh's primary duty was not to rule people. It was to uphold Ma'at. His legitimacy rested on his ability to maintain balance between gods, humans, and nature. Every law he issued, every judgment he made, and every war he fought was framed as an act of cosmic maintenance. When he punished criminals, he was not being cruel. He was restoring balance. When he demanded taxes or labor, he was not exploiting. He was ensuring order. Even warfare was justified as the destruction of chaos beyond Egypt's borders, because the pharaoh upheld Ma'at. Opposing him meant opposing the universe itself. Egyptian law was not based on equality or rights. It was based on correction. A crime was not simply an offense against another person. It was a disruption of balance. Judges did not ask whether a law had been broken in a technical sense. They asked whether Ma'at had been violated. Punishment aimed to restore harmony, not to reform the individual. This made authority morally unquestionable. If a judgment came from those acting in service of Ma'at, then it was inherently just, even if it appeared harsh. Truth in Egypt was not subjective. It was alignment with Ma'at. To speak truth was to support order. To lie was to introduce chaos. This belief extended into politics. A loyal official was truthful by definition. A disobedient one was deceitful, even if his words were factually correct. Truth was measured by loyalty to the system, not by independent reasoning. In this way, Ma'at controlled thought as much as behavior. Ma'at justified inequality by framing hierarchy as natural and necessary. Just as the sky was above the earth and the Nile flowed in one direction, society had its proper structure. Pharaoh above all, officials above workers, men above women, elders above youth. Questioning one's place in society was not a demand for justice. It was a disturbance of balance. Obedience was virtue. Acceptance was wisdom. This worldview created stability at the cost of freedom, and most Egyptians accepted the trade willingly. The most powerful aspect of Ma'at was that it did not rely on constant enforcement. People internalized it. They monitored their own thoughts and actions, fearing not only punishment in life, but judgment after death. The soul itself was weighed against Ma'at. If one had lived dishonestly, rebelliously, or selfishly, the heart would be heavy with chaos and unworthy of eternal life. Thus, obedience followed individuals into their private lives. Even alone, they acted as though order was watching. When disasters occurred, famine, plague, invasion, they did not undermine Ma'at. They reinforced it. Such events were interpreted as signs that balance had been disturbed. The solution was not rebellion against authority, but greater obedience. more rituals, more offerings, more loyalty. This belief protected the system from collapse. Even failure strengthened the ideology. Ma'at made change dangerous. Innovation risked imbalance. Reform risked chaos. Tradition became sacred simply because it had endured. This created one of the most conservative civilizations in history. While dynasties changed, the underlying structure remained. Absolute power persisted not because it was enforced, but because it felt correct. Order became comfort. Obedience became peace. Ma'at answered the most dangerous question any authority faces. Why should we obey? The answer was simple and terrifying. Because reality depends on it. Under Ma'at, obedience was not political. It was existential. To obey was to help the sun rise, the river flow, and the dead find peace. To resist was to side with chaos and threaten all life. This belief did not make Egypt perfect. It made it stable. It allowed absolute power to endure not through chains, but through conscience. And as long as Ma'at ruled the minds of the people, the throne of Egypt needed no defense. In ancient Egypt, power did not merely command armies or issue laws. It flowed through water. Whoever controlled the Nile controlled food, time, labor, and ultimately life itself. The river was Egypt's heartbeat, and the state wrapped its hands around that pulse so tightly that survival became inseparable from obedience. Absolute power was not enforced only from the throne. It rose every year with the floodwaters and receded only when the state allowed it. To live in Egypt was to wait on the Nile. To survive was to depend on those who claimed to control it. Unlike rivers that flooded unpredictably and violently, the Nile followed a rhythm, rising, spreading, and retreating with remarkable regularity. This cycle made Egypt fertile, but it also made it vulnerable. When the flood was too low, crops failed. When it was too high, villages were destroyed. When it came late, famine followed. There was no alternative water source. No rain-fed agriculture. No escape into other fertile lands. The Nile was not one resource among many. It was the only one that mattered. This reality created the conditions for centralized control long before formal empires existed. Managing the river meant coordinating entire regions. Measuring it required specialists. Responding to its failures required stored surplus, and surplus required authority. The state did not claim to command the Nile outright. That would have challenged the gods. Instead, it claimed to understand it. Water levels were measured carefully using stone markers and structures. These measurements were not public knowledge. They were recorded, interpreted, and announced by officials acting in the name of higher authority. The people did not know whether the flood would be good or bad until they were told. Knowledge became a form of power, more subtle than force. By controlling information about the river, its timing, its height, its meaning, the state controlled expectations. Hope and fear were regulated as carefully as water. Floodwater alone was not enough. Canals had to be dug. Fields had to be leveled. Dikes had to be maintained. None of this could be done by individuals or small communities alone. The state organized labor on a massive scale. Farmers were summoned when the river receded, ordered to dig, repair, and prepare land. Not as a choice, but as a duty. This labor was framed not as exploitation, but as service to life itself. If canals failed, crops failed. If crops failed, people starved. The logic was simple and brutal: obey or suffer. Perhaps the greatest instrument of control was not the river, but what was done with its harvest. Grain was collected, stored, counted, and redistributed by the state. Taxes were paid in food, not currency. Surplus did not remain in villages, it flowed upward. These granaries were more than warehouses, they were symbols of authority. In times of abundance, the state took its share. In times of famine, it decided who would eat. Survival was no longer natural, it was political. This monopoly transformed loyalty into necessity. To be on good terms with authority was to live. To be excluded was to starve. Famines occurred. They were terrifying, slow disasters that hollowed bodies and broke spirits. Yet even famine reinforced the state's authority. When hunger spread, people did not question the system. They turned to it. They begged officials, they prayed to rulers, they accepted harsher demands in exchange for survival. The state became not only ruler, but provider. Dependence deepened. Gratitude replaced resistance. In this way, even failure strengthened control. The state presented itself as a shield against nature's cruelty. Officials spoke of planning, foresight, and divine favor. When food was distributed, it was framed as generosity, not as the return of what had been taken. This narrative mattered. People believed they survived because of authority, not despite it. The idea that survival could exist without centralized control faded from memory. Power became invisible because it felt necessary. During flood seasons, when fields lay underwater, millions were mobilized for state projects, digging canals, building temples, raising monuments. This labor was justified as productive use of idle time, but it also reinforced hierarchy. The state decided how bodies were used, when they worked, and for what purpose. Survival depended not only on water and food, but on willingness to serve. Life was no longer owned by individuals. It was managed. When floods were good, rulers claimed divine approval. When they failed, explanations were spiritual, not administrative. The people were told balance had been disturbed by moral failure, insufficient ritual, or hidden disorder. The solution was never decentralization. It was deeper obedience. Thus, the Nile became a language through which authority spoke. Every rise and fall carried political meaning. The river determined the calendar. Planting seasons, labor cycles, festivals, and taxes all followed its rhythm. By organizing life around the Nile, the state organized time itself. People did not plan independently. They waited for announcements, rituals, and commands. Time became collective, controlled, and predictable. Freedom requires unpredictability. Egypt offered stability instead. Over generations, dependence hardened into acceptance. Children grew up knowing that food came from granaries, water from canals, and protection from authority. The idea of self-sufficiency became unthinkable. This was the genius and cruelty of the system. Absolute power did not need constant violence. It controlled the conditions of life so completely that resistance felt suicidal. In controlling the Nile, the state controlled agriculture. In controlling agriculture, it controlled food. In controlling food, it controlled people. This was not tyranny in the modern sense. It was something more profound. A civilization built on managed survival. The river flowed freely, but life did not. And as long as the Nile rose and fell, and as long as the state stood between its waters and the people, absolute power in Egypt did not need to shout. It simply waited, like the river itself, patient, inevitable, and essential. Absolute power in ancient Egypt did not operate through the pharaoh's voice alone. One man, even a god-king, could not watch every field, count every grain of wheat, or judge every dispute. The true strength of Egyptian rule lay not only on the throne, but in an enormous, disciplined, and largely unseen system that carried the pharaoh's will into every village and household. This machinery of power, made of bureaucrats, viziers, and scribes, was quiet, methodical, and relentless. It did not need to terrify. It only needed to function. If the pharaoh was the mind of Egypt, this system was its nervous system. Most Egyptians would never speak directly to the pharaoh. Many would never see him at all. Yet his authority shaped every aspect of their lives. What they grew, what they owed, where they worked, and how they were judged. This was possible because power in Egypt was not personal. It was procedural. Orders flowed downward through layers of officials. Information flowed upward in the form of reports, tallies, and records. The system did not rely on inspiration or charisma. It relied on routine. Routine made power permanent. At the top of this machinery stood the vizier, the highest official, beneath the pharaoh. He was not a rival, but an extension, an administrator entrusted with translating divine authority into daily governance. The vizier oversaw courts, taxes, labor, temples, and officials across the land. He ensured that laws were enforced, resources were allocated, and corruption was punished, at least when it threatened order rather than power. His authority came not from election or popularity, but from proximity to the throne. He spoke with the pharaoh's voice, and his judgments carried sacred weight. In practice, the vizier ruled the state so that the pharaoh could rule the universe. Beneath the vizier stretched a vast hierarchy of officials. Regional governors, tax collectors, overseers of labor, inspectors of canals, keepers of granaries. Each had a defined role. Each answered to someone above him. This structure prevented chaos. No single official controlled everything. Power was distributed, but responsibility always flowed upward. Crucially, this system was standardized. Procedures were repeated year after year. Forms were copied, measurements were fixed, deviations were recorded. A system that records does not forget. A system that does not forget cannot be escaped. At the heart of the entire system were the scribes. They did not wield weapons. They wielded ink. Most Egyptians could not read or write. Literacy was rare, difficult, and deliberately restricted. Writing was not just a skill. It was a gatekeeping mechanism. Scribes recorded taxes, counted harvests, documented labor, issued orders, and preserved laws. What they wrote became reality. If a harvest was recorded as sufficient, the tax was owed, regardless of what the farmer felt. If a debt was written, it existed. Power did not argue, it documented. Once something was written, it was fixed. Spoken words could be denied. Written words endured. This gave scribes extraordinary power. They did not merely observe society, they defined it. Land ownership, labor obligations, criminal guilt, and even history itself depended on records. Yet scribes were not independent. Their power flowed upward. They were trained to obey, not to question. Accuracy mattered, but loyalty mattered more. Truth in Egypt was what was written in service of order. Taxes were the lifeblood of the state, and bureaucracy ensured they were unavoidable. Farmers paid in grain, workers paid in labor, artisans paid in goods. Officials measured fields, assessed yields, and calculated obligations. Disputes were rare, not because the system was fair, but because it was absolute. There was no concept of negotiating with authority. The numbers were the numbers. The record was the record. The bureaucracy did not threaten. It simply arrived. During flood seasons, when farming paused, the state redirected human energy. Officials summoned workers for canals, temples, monuments, and transport. Names were recorded. Attendance was tracked. Labor was not voluntary. It was owed, but the system framed it as duty, not oppression. Serving the state was serving order. To refuse was to reject one's place in the universe. Bureaucracy turned bodies into units, time into schedules, and obedience into routine. Courts existed, but they were not independent. Judges were officials. Law was an expression of authority, not a restraint on it. Cases were recorded, testimonies written, verdicts issued. The appearance of procedure created the impression of fairness, but outcomes rarely challenged the structure itself. Justice was not blind. It saw hierarchy clearly, and because decisions were written, they carried the weight of inevitability. The state did not need spies everywhere. It had paperwork. Reports flowed continuously, from villages to regional centers, from regions to the capital. Harvests, births, deaths, disputes, and labor were all counted. This created a form of passive surveillance. People knew they were being recorded, even if no one was watching at that moment. The fear was not of immediate punishment, but of eventual discovery. The brilliance of Egypt's system was its impersonality. Officials could change. Pharaohs could die. But the machinery continued. This continuity created stability unmatched in the ancient world. While other civilizations rose and collapsed rapidly, Egypt endured. The bureaucracy did not innovate often, but it did not need to. Its purpose was not progress, but preservation. Over time, authority became background noise. People stopped seeing it as external force and began experiencing it as the natural order of things. Forms had to be filled, grain had to be delivered, labor had to be performed. Not because someone threatened them, but because that was how life worked. This was the final triumph of the machinery of power. Pharaohs were divine, but mortal. Bureaucracy was neither, and that made it eternal. Even weak rulers relied on it. Even foreign conquerors adopted it. The machinery adapted without changing its essence, because true power does not always sit on a throne. Sometimes it sits behind a desk holding a pen. Egypt did not rule by terror alone. It ruled by organization, by records, by routine, by systems so deeply embedded that resistance felt pointless. The pharaoh's will did not need to be shouted. It was written, bound, archived, and enforced quietly, every day, by men who believed they were maintaining order. This was the machinery of power. Invisible, efficient, unyielding, and as long as it turned, absolute rule in Egypt did not depend on the strength of a single god-king, but on a system that made obedience unavoidable. In ancient Egypt, power did not always arrive with soldiers or commands spoken aloud. Often it arrived silently, etched into stone, brushed onto papyrus, or pressed into clay. Writing was not merely a tool for communication. It was a weapon, a subtle, enduring instrument of control that shaped reality itself. Those who could write defined truth, history, law, and memory. Those who could not were forced to live inside that written world without ever touching it. Literacy in Egypt was rare by design, and rarity is power. To the Egyptians, writing was not a neutral invention. It was sacred. Words written in hieroglyphs were believed to possess power beyond sound. A name carved into stone could grant eternal life. A spell written correctly could protect the soul. A decree written in ink could reshape society. Writing was thought to mirror creation itself. Just as the gods spoke the world into being, scribes wrote reality into permanence. What was written did not merely describe, it made things true. This belief elevated writing above speech. Spoken words vanished, written words endured. The vast majority of Egyptians could not read or write. Learning hieroglyphs took years of disciplined training. It required access to education, time away from labor, and acceptance into a controlled institution. This was not accidental. By restricting literacy, the state ensured that only a small class could interpret laws, records, and sacred texts. Knowledge was filtered. Information moved in one direction, from authority to the people. Illiteracy kept the population dependent. Literacy kept power concentrated. Scribes were everywhere and nowhere. They stood beside tax collectors, judges, priests, and officials. They observed, recorded, and confirmed. Rarely did they argue or command openly. Their power lay in documentation. A scribe's mark could decide how much grain a farmer owed, whether a laborer was punished, or how history would remember an event. They did not need to threaten, they only needed to write. Once written, a decision became official. Once official, it became unquestionable. The pen was not mightier than the sword. It replaced it. Egypt was obsessed with record-keeping. Land surveys, harvest tallies, labor lists, court proceedings, temple donations, and royal decrees were all meticulously documented. This created a world where nothing truly disappeared. A man could flee his village, but his name remained on records. A debt could outlast a lifetime. An obligation could be inherited. Writing made power permanent. It also made resistance nearly impossible. You could argue with a person. You could not argue with a document stamped with authority. Taxes were enforced not by violence, but by arithmetic. Fields were measured, yields were estimated, obligations were calculated. These numbers were written down. Once a figure existed on papyrus, it was final. Disputes were meaningless if the record said otherwise. Even famine did not erase debt. It merely postponed collection. Writing transformed economic control into bureaucratic inevitability. Egyptian laws were not compiled into a single public code. They existed as rulings, precedents, and recorded judgments, all interpreted by officials who could read. This meant that the law was not something people knew. It was something they experienced, and that experience depended entirely on those who controlled the written word. Justice was not transparent. It was documented, and documentation favored authority. Writing allowed the state to control not only the present, but the past. Victories were recorded, failures were omitted, enemies were erased from inscriptions, names were scratched away as punishment. History was not preserved, it was curated. Temples and monuments told a story of uninterrupted order, divine favor, and righteous rule. Future generations would read these walls and believe stability had always existed. Writing turned memory into obedience. Religious texts reinforced political authority. Hymns praised rulers. Ritual inscriptions emphasized order, hierarchy, and duty. Moral teachings promoted humility, acceptance, and loyalty. Because these texts were written and sacred, they carried unquestionable authority. They were copied generation after generation, embedding obedience into culture itself. Even private wisdom texts encouraged people to know their place, respect superiors, and avoid challenging authority. Writing shaped thought. Those who could not write could not leave their own version of events. Farmers, laborers, and workers lived and died without records. Their struggles vanished with them. The only voices that survived were those with ink. This silence was one of the state's greatest strengths. History spoke with one voice, the voice of authority. The state did not need constant physical oversight. Writing did that work. Censuses tracked populations, labor lists tracked attendance, court records tracked behavior, temple registers tracked loyalty. People knew they were being recorded, even if no official stood nearby. This knowledge shaped behavior. Writing created invisible walls. Writing outlived kings. It outlasted dynasties. It survived invasions. Foreign rulers adopted Egyptian writing systems, not just to communicate, but to rule. Because once authority is written, it does not fade easily. Stone cracks, ink fades, but ideas written into systems endure. Writing allowed Egypt to rule without constant force. It replaced chaos with procedure. It turned obedience into routine. It transformed belief into documentation. Those who controlled writing controlled law, economy, religion, and memory. They controlled reality. And so, while armies defended Egypt's borders and pharaohs sat upon golden thrones, the most powerful weapon in the civilization was quiet, patient, and precise. It was the written word. In ancient Egypt, power did not flow from a single source. While the pharaoh stood at the center of the universe as a living god, he did not rule alone. Surrounding the throne was a vast religious world, temples rising like mountains of stone, gods numbering in the hundreds, and priests who spoke daily to the divine. Together, these forces created a system of shared authority, one that usually strengthened absolute power, but occasionally threatened to rival it. Religion was the backbone of the state. but a backbone can support, or it can bend. Temples were not houses of public worship in the modern sense. Ordinary people rarely entered their inner spaces. Temples were sacred engines designed to sustain the universe itself. Inside, priests performed rituals to feed the gods, clothe their statues, awaken them each morning, and lull them to rest at night. If these rituals failed, Egyptians believed the sun might not rise, the Nile might not flood, and chaos might overwhelm the land. This belief gave temples enormous importance. They were not optional institutions, they were essential to survival. By supporting temples, the state presented itself as the protector of existence itself. Temples were also economic giants. They owned land, cattle, workshops, ships, granaries, and vast numbers of workers. Offerings poured in from taxes, war spoils, and royal gifts. Over time, some temples rivaled entire provinces in wealth. Priests managed this wealth in the name of the gods, but wealth is never neutral. Control of resources meant influence. Influence meant leverage. And leverage, even when wrapped in holiness, was power. Priests occupied a unique position. They were neither kings nor commoners. They lived within strict rules of purity, shaved their bodies, washed repeatedly, and followed complex ritual schedules. Their authority came from access. They entered places others could not. They spoke words others were forbidden to know. They interpreted signs from the gods that no one else could read. In a deeply religious society, this made priests indispensable. The state needed them to maintain divine favor. The people trusted them to understand the will of the gods. Most of the time, temples reinforced royal power. Rituals proclaimed the pharaoh as chosen by the gods. Inscriptions showed gods granting him victory, long life, and dominion over chaos. Priests recited these truths daily. By embedding the pharaoh into ritual life, religion made his rule feel eternal and unquestionable. Even when the ruler was absent, sick, or weak, the rituals continued, and so did belief in his divine role. Religion filled the gaps where force could not reach. Despite their influence, priests did not officially outrank the pharaoh. The ruler was still the supreme religious authority, the high priest of every god. In theory, every ritual performed in Egypt was done on his behalf. This arrangement was deliberate. It allowed religious power to flourish without replacing political power. The gods had priests, but the priests had a king. As long as this balance held, the system was remarkably stable. Over centuries, however, this balance sometimes shifted. As temples accumulated land and wealth, the priesthood, especially of major gods, grew increasingly independent. In some periods, high priests controlled armies, collected taxes, and governed regions. Their loyalty was still expressed in religious language, but their power was real and tangible. The gods' servants began to resemble kings in everything but name. Oracles were one of the most delicate points of tension. Gods were believed to speak through signs, dreams, and priestly interpretation. When an oracle approved a decision, it carried immense authority. But interpretation is never neutral. A favorable oracle could legitimize a ruler. An unfavorable one could undermine him. When priests controlled divine messages, they held the ability to shape political outcomes without appearing to do so. Religion could whisper what armies could not declare. Unlike distant rulers, priests were present in daily religious life. Festivals, prayers, funerary rites, all passed through temple hands. This gave priests a kind of moral authority the state could not easily replace. When people trusted priests more than officials, the potential for tension grew. Faith could shift loyalty. At times, rulers acted to curb priestly power, redistributing land, limiting temple wealth, or elevating new gods to dilute old institutions. These actions were dangerous. Interfering with religion risked cosmic imbalance and public unrest. Every move had to be justified as divinely sanctioned, even absolute rulers had to tread carefully around belief. On rare occasions, religious authority directly rivaled royal authority. Powerful priesthoods acted independently, sometimes governing territories in all but name. These moments revealed a truth beneath the system. Absolute power in Egypt depended on religious cooperation. Without it, the throne weakened, yet outright conflict was rare. The system was designed to bend, not break. The genius of Egypt's religious political structure lay in its flexibility. Temples strengthened authority by legitimizing it. Priests benefited from royal support. Both depended on belief in order. When tensions arose, they were absorbed into ritual, symbolism, and tradition, rather than open revolt. Power was negotiated through theology. Religion was both the state's greatest ally and its greatest risk. By empowering priests, the state gained stability and legitimacy. By empowering belief, it also created institutions that could one day question power. Yet for most of Egypt's history, the alliance held, because both sides understood the same truth. Without order, both throne and temple would fall. Temples did not replace the state. Priests did not overthrow kings. Instead, together they created a system where power felt divinely distributed, yet centrally controlled. The pharaoh ruled the land. The priests ruled the sacred spaces. The gods ruled the cosmos. And as long as each remained in place, Egypt endured, stable, obedient, and bound together by belief. Religion did not merely support absolute power, it shared it, carefully, cautiously, and always beneath the shadow of the throne. In ancient Egypt, law was not a shield protecting individuals from power. It was an extension of power itself. Justice did not exist to limit authority. It existed to express it. There were courts, judges, investigations, and punishments. But there was no concept of equality before the law as it is understood today. The law did not stand above the ruler. It flowed from him, and because of that, justice in Egypt was absolute, flexible, and deeply unequal. Yet to the people of Egypt, this system did not feel unjust. It felt ordered. Egyptian law was rooted in the belief that society existed to maintain balance. Justice was not about protecting personal freedom. It was about correcting disruption. A crime was not an offense against an individual. It was an offense against order. This distinction mattered deeply. If law existed to protect order, then those who represented order, the pharaoh and his officials, could never truly be wrong. Their decisions might be harsh, but they were never unjust in principle. Justice was not blind. It saw exactly who you were and where you stood. Unlike later civilizations, Egypt did not operate under a single, publicly displayed legal code. Laws existed as traditions, rulings, precedents, and administrative decisions recorded by scribes. This made the law flexible and dangerous. Without a fixed code, justice could adapt to circumstances, but it could also bend to power. What mattered most was not what had happened, but who was involved. A peasant and an official committing the same act did not face the same consequences. Hierarchy shaped justice at every level. At the top of the system stood the pharaoh, who was not subject to law. He was its source. His word could create rules, suspend them, or erase them entirely. This was not considered tyranny. Since the pharaoh embodied order itself, limiting his authority would have meant limiting balance. The idea that a ruler could be judged by the same standards as his subjects would have seemed absurd, almost dangerous, to Egyptian thinking. Courts existed across Egypt, handling disputes over land, theft, assault, and obligations. Judges were officials, not independent authorities. They answered upward, not outward. Proceedings relied heavily on testimony, oaths, and written records. There was no defense attorney, no jury of equals. The goal was not fairness as we define it, but resolution that restored order. The appearance of procedure created legitimacy, even when outcomes were predetermined. Punishments in Egypt were often severe. Beatings, mutilation, forced labor, exile, and execution were all used. Prisons were rare. The goal was not rehabilitation. It was deterrence and restoration of balance. A punished body sent a message to others. Disorder has consequences. Mercy was possible, but it came from authority, not law. Forgiveness was a gift, not a right. Equality before the law did not exist. Social rank shaped outcomes decisively. Officials received lighter punishments than commoners. Slaves had almost no legal protection. Women could own property and bring cases, but their standing depended heavily on context and male support. Justice reflected society, not ideals. This inequality was not hidden, it was accepted as natural. Just as the Nile flowed in one direction, so too did justice. Confessions were central to Egyptian justice. They were seen as proof of restored truth, but confessions were often extracted through pressure or punishment. The system assumed guilt more easily than innocence. Order mattered more than certainty. If a confession restored balance, the method mattered less. Crimes against the state, rebellion, corruption, sacrilege, were treated with extreme severity. These acts threatened not just people, but cosmic order. Punishments were public and symbolic. Bodies were displayed, names were erased, memory itself was used as punishment. To be forgotten was worse than death, because law was flexible. It could be used strategically. Officials could target enemies, enforce obedience, and suppress dissent while maintaining the appearance of justice. The system did not need to be fair. It needed to be effective. Fear of unpredictable punishment kept people cautious. Predictability breeds resistance. Uncertainty breeds obedience. Despite its inequality, Egyptian law rarely provoked mass resistance. Why? Because people did not expect equality. They expected stability. As long as life continued, crops grew, floods came, rituals worked. The system was accepted. Justice was judged by outcomes, not principles. Individual suffering was tragic, but it was not central to Egyptian ethics. The survival of the whole mattered more than the pain of one. This belief allowed harsh punishments to coexist with a stable society. Law was not compassionate, it was functional. In Egypt, law did not restrain authority. It expressed it. Punishment did not protect rights. It protected order. Courts did not challenge power. They confirmed it. This system created one of the longest-lasting civilizations in history, but at the cost of legal equality. Justice served the throne, and as long as people believed that order was sacred and chaos was fatal, law without limits did not feel like oppression. It felt like necessity. In ancient Egypt, wealth did not belong to individuals in the modern sense. Land, labor, crops, animals, even time itself, were understood as part of a sacred economy overseen by gods and administered by the king. Ownership was layered, symbolic, and deeply political. At the top stood the divine order. Beneath it stood the pharaoh, and beneath him stood everyone else. To live in Egypt was to participate in a system where survival depended on giving, and where giving was never optional. Egyptians did not believe wealth was created by human effort alone. Crops grew because the Nile flooded. The Nile flooded because the gods allowed it. Therefore, abundance was a divine gift. If wealth came from the gods, then it did not truly belong to farmers, craftsmen, or merchants. It belonged to the divine order. And the pharaoh, as its guardian, had the right and duty to redistribute it. Taxes were not theft. They were restoration. This belief transformed economic extraction into moral obligation. In theory, all land in Egypt belonged to the pharaoh. Individuals did not own land. They held the right to use it as long as they fulfilled their obligations. Fields could be reassigned. Labor could be demanded. Harvests could be redirected. This was not arbitrary confiscation. It was the logic of divine kingship. Since the pharaoh maintained order, Everything that existed within that order fell under his authority. Ownership was conditional, loyalty made it stable. Egypt did not operate on money in the modern sense. Taxes were paid in grain, animals, goods, and labor. What mattered was not currency, but control of essentials. Grain was the most important of all. It fed people, paid workers, supported temples, and sustained armies. Whoever controlled grain controlled life. Tax collectors measured fields, estimated yields, and set obligations. These obligations were recorded, enforced, and rarely negotiable. Payment was expected regardless of hardship. A poor flood did not erase duty, it increased dependence. Beyond internal taxation, Egypt extracted tribute from conquered lands and subject regions. Gold, silver, livestock, luxury goods, and captives flowed into royal and temple storehouses. Tribute was not just economic, it was symbolic. Each shipment was proof that order extended beyond Egypt's borders. Each offering reinforced the pharaoh's role as ruler, not just of people, but of the world as it was known. Wealth became spectacle. A large portion of Egypt's wealth flowed into temples. These institutions owned vast lands, employed thousands, and stored enormous reserves. Officially, this wealth belonged to the gods. In practice, it reinforced the state. Temples supported priests, funded rituals, fed workers, and stabilized society during crisis. The division between royal and divine wealth was blurred by design. Supporting the gods meant supporting the system that upheld authority. For most Egyptians, the most significant tax was not grain, it was labor. During flood seasons, when fields were submerged, workers were summoned for state projects. Canals, temples, monuments, roads, all were built through organized labor. This labor was not considered exploitation. It was framed as duty, participation in order, and service to the divine. Your body was not entirely your own. It belonged in part to the system that sustained you. The state did redistribute wealth, but on its own terms. Workers were fed, officials were paid, soldiers were supplied, temples were endowed. This redistribution created loyalty. Survival depended on remaining within the system. Those outside it, runaways, rebels, the unregistered, faced hunger and isolation. The system did not need to be generous. It only needed to be indispensable. Wealth in Egypt was not distributed equally, nor was it intended to be. Officials lived comfortably, priests held privilege. The elite enjoyed luxury. Common people lived modestly, often precariously. This inequality was justified through cosmic order. Just as gods were above humans, so rulers were above subjects. Wealth reflected place. Place reflected balance. Corruption existed. Officials skimmed. Priests hoarded. Overseers abused power. Yet the system tolerated a degree of corruption as long as it did not threaten stability. Minor injustice was acceptable if order remained intact. Absolute purity was less important than continuity. In times of famine, the state released grain from storehouses. This act was remembered as generosity, not obligation. People survived because the system allowed it. This narrative strengthened loyalty. Even when the state had caused dependency, it was seen as savior. Power that feeds is rarely questioned. Not the farmer who tilled the soil, not the craftsman who shaped stone, not the merchant who traded goods. Egypt was owned by the system itself, by the divine order as interpreted and enforced by the pharaoh and his institutions. Individuals lived within Egypt. Authority possessed it. Every basket of grain, every day of labor, every tribute shipment was obedience made tangible. Wealth flowed upward not just because it could, but because it had to. The system was built so that survival required participation. To refuse was to step outside order and outside life. Absolute power in Egypt was not just ideological or political. It was economic. It controlled land, food, labor, and distribution. It decided who ate, who worked, and who prospered. And because this control was framed as divine stewardship rather than domination, it endured. Wealth did not merely support power. It was power. In ancient Egypt, power was not only spoken, written, or enforced. It was built. It rose from the desert in stone and shadow, visible from miles away, dominating the horizon and the imagination. Long after a ruler's voice fell silent, his monuments continued to speak. They did not argue. They did not persuade. They asserted. Architecture in Egypt was propaganda carved into eternity, a constant reminder that authority was vast, ancient, and unchallengeable. To live beneath these structures was to live beneath power itself. Most people in ancient Egypt lived in modest homes made of mud brick, fragile, temporary, easily erased by time. In stark contrast, the monuments of the state were built from stone, limestone, granite, sandstone, materials meant to endure. This contrast was deliberate. Stone symbolized permanence. It declared that while ordinary lives were fleeting, authority was eternal. The ruler's power did not end with death. It was meant to outlast generations, dynasties, even memory. When people saw stone monuments rising from a land of fragile homes, they understood their place in the world. No structures better represent Egypt's monumental ideology than the pyramids. They were not simply tombs. They were cosmic machines, religious statements, and political declarations combined into a single shape. The pyramid's form, stable, immovable, rising toward the heavens, was a visual metaphor for absolute rule. It suggested hierarchy made permanent, many supporting one, the base serving the apex. Thousands labored so one could rule forever. The message was unmistakable. The pharaoh was worth more than a lifetime of human effort. Building monuments required staggering organization. Stone had to be quarried, transported, shaped, and assembled with astonishing precision. This could not be done by force alone. It required compliance. The very existence of monuments proved that the state could mobilize enormous populations without collapse. Every block placed was evidence of control over labor, time, food, and belief. People did not merely see power, they participated in constructing it. Temples were not designed for crowds. They were designed for awe. Approaching a temple meant passing through massive gates, touring walls and narrowing corridors. Columns rose like forests of stone. Ceilings pressed down. Light dimmed, space shrank. This architecture was psychological. The human body felt small. The gods felt immense. Authority felt overwhelming. The ruler, depicted in reliefs larger than life, stood at the center of this world, offering to gods, defeating enemies, sustaining order. The temple did not ask for belief. It imposed it. Egyptian art and architecture ignored realistic proportion in favor of symbolic scale. The pharaoh was always larger than others. Gods were larger still. This was not artistic limitation. It was ideological clarity. Size equaled importance. Importance equaled authority. Even illiterate observers understood this language instantly. The stone taught them who mattered. Unlike ceremonies that ended, monuments never stopped performing their function. A temple offering scene carved into stone repeated the ritual forever. A victory relief never stopped defeating enemies. This gave the illusion that order was constant and uninterrupted, even when reality was messy. Monuments froze idealized moments in time and presented them as eternal truth. Walls were covered in inscriptions praising rulers, gods, and victories. These texts were not meant to inform. They were meant to declare. Failures were omitted. Defeats were rewritten as triumphs. Rivals were erased. Stone did not argue back. By controlling what was written in monuments, the state controlled memory itself. Living among monuments changed how people thought. If power had always existed in stone, it felt natural. If it was eternal, resisting it felt foolish. Rebellion might succeed for a moment, but the stones would remain. This sense of inevitability discouraged resistance more effectively than violence. Monuments reshaped the land into a sacred geography. Temples aligned with celestial events. Pyramids mirrored the sun's path. Cities were organized around ritual spaces. The environment itself became ideological. You did not merely obey authority, you walked through it every day. Monuments were also messages to outsiders. Visiting envoys saw colossal statues, endless reliefs of defeated enemies, and overwhelming scale. The message was clear. Egypt was powerful, ancient, and protected by the gods. Intimidation reduced the need for constant warfare. Monuments were expensive. They consumed labor, resources, and time on a massive scale. But cost was not a flaw, it was the feature. Only an all-powerful system could afford such waste. The ability to divert resources from survival to symbolism proved control was total. A society surrounded by symbols of power does not need constant coercion. People police themselves. The monuments watched silently. They reminded everyone who ruled, and who always would. Even centuries later, monuments shaped how history was remembered. Later rulers associated themselves with ancient structures to claim legitimacy. Destroying monuments was seen as an act of cosmic violence. Power anchored in stone could be borrowed, but rarely erased. Pyramids, temples, statues, and walls were not passive objects. They were active instruments of rule. They taught obedience. They reinforced hierarchy. They erased doubt. They made power visible, tangible, and eternal. Words can be questioned. Laws can be changed. Rulers can die. Stone remains. And as long as the monument stood, casting shadows across the Nile, dominating cities and outlasting generations, the message of Egypt's absolute power was never forgotten. You are small. The order is eternal. Obedience is older than you, and it will outlive you. In ancient Egypt, absolute power was designed to appear timeless and unshakable, but it was never naive. Beneath the language of divine order, cosmic balance, and sacred kingship lay a clear understanding of reality. Power that cannot defend itself will not endure. While religion legitimized rule and bureaucracy enforced it, the army protected it. War was not a contradiction of Egypt's ideology of order. It was an essential part of it. The Egyptian army did not exist merely to conquer. It existed to preserve the illusion and the reality of eternal control. To the Egyptian worldview, Egypt was the center of order in a hostile universe. Beyond its borders lay deserts, foreign lands, and peoples associated with chaos. These outsiders were not simply enemies, they were embodiments of disorder, threatening the fragile balance of the world. War, therefore, was not aggression, it was defensive existence. Every military campaign was framed as a righteous act to protect Ma'at. Victory was proof of divine favor. Defeat was not admitted, only reinterpreted or erased. The army became the physical manifestation of order, pushing back chaos. In Egypt's earliest periods, warfare was limited. Communities defended themselves with temporary militias. But as the state grew, so did its needs. Borders expanded. Trade routes required protection. Resources beyond the Nile Valley, gold, stone, timber, became essential. Temporary forces were no longer sufficient. The solution was professionalization. Egypt developed a standing army loyal not to local leaders but to the state and the pharaoh. Soldiers were trained, equipped, fed, and organized through centralized control. War became an institution. The pharaoh was not merely a symbolic leader in war. He was portrayed as its driving force, the divine warrior who defeated enemies with supernatural strength. Reliefs show him towering over foes, smiting them with a single blow. This imagery mattered more than tactical reality. The message was clear. Egypt did not win wars because of numbers or strategy, but because its ruler embodied divine power. The army fought for the pharaoh, but also because of him. Egyptian warfare was as much about display as destruction. Campaigns were recorded in inscriptions, carved into temple walls, and celebrated in rituals. Enemies were depicted as bound, crushed, or kneeling. Foreign lands were reduced to symbols under the pharaoh's feet. These images were not meant for the defeated. They were meant for the Egyptian people. They reinforced the idea that resistance, external or internal, was futile. Military expansion was rarely about territory alone. It was about control of resources. Gold from the south, timber from the north, stone, copper, incense, livestock, captives. The army secured supply lines that fed temples, monuments, and the bureaucracy. Conquest funded stability. Victory abroad strengthened control at home. Soldiers were not independent warriors. They were part of the same machinery as scribes and officials. They were paid in rations. Their service was recorded. Their loyalty was monitored. Military success could elevate status, but disobedience was punished severely. The army did not threaten the throne. It reinforced it. This integration prevented generals from becoming rivals. Rather than relying solely on campaigns, Egypt built fortresses along borders and trade routes. These structures projected authority into contested spaces. Fortresses were symbols of permanence. They declared that Egypt did not merely pass through foreign lands, it watched them constantly. This reduced the need for constant war while maintaining dominance. Egypt did not fight every enemy. Often, reputation was enough. Stories of crushed rebellions, annihilated towns, and divine punishment spread beyond borders. The goal was deterrence. If chaos feared Egypt, order remained secure. War produced captives, men, women, and children absorbed into the Egyptian system as laborers, soldiers, or servants. This served two purposes. It removed potential threats and increased the state's workforce. Conquest fed the economy and reinforced hierarchy. While the army was aimed outward, its presence also shaped internal obedience. The knowledge that force existed, organized, disciplined, and loyal, discouraged rebellion. The army did not need to patrol constantly. Its reputation was enough. Absolute power relies on force not as constant action, but as constant possibility. Violence was not chaotic. It was ritualized. Enemies were executed symbolically. Victory celebrations followed religious scripts. War became another form of sacred duty. This framing allowed violence to exist without undermining the ideology of order. At times, military success created tension. Powerful commanders gained prestige. Soldiers gained influence. The state responded carefully, rewarding loyalty, rotating leadership, reinforcing religious legitimacy. The army was strong but never allowed to forget who commanded the cosmos. Unlike later empires, Egypt rarely experienced military coups. The system was too deeply integrated. Soldiers believed they served divine order, not personal ambition. Religion, bureaucracy, and propaganda bound the army to the throne. Success in war reinforced the ruler's divine status. Victory proved the gods favored him. Failure threatened legitimacy. Thus, military action was both practical and symbolic. The army did not just protect the state. It proved it deserved to exist. Egyptian ideology emphasized stability, continuity, and tradition, yet it relied on violence to preserve those ideals. This paradox was resolved by belief. Violence in service of order was not chaos, it was correction. The army existed so that society could believe itself peaceful. Ultimately, the army was not the foundation of power in Egypt. It was the shield around it. Religion justified rule. Bureaucracy enforced it. Architecture displayed it. The army ensured no one could break it. And as long as soldiers marched beneath sacred standards, believing they fought for the gods themselves, absolute power in Egypt remained secure, not only by faith and fear, but by force ready to be used. Absolute power is often described from the top, from thrones, gods, monuments, and armies. But its true measure is found below, in the lives of ordinary people who carried the weight of the system every day. In ancient Egypt, millions lived beneath the shadow of the throne, farmers tied to the rhythm of the Nile, workers summoned by the state, servants absorbed into households, and slaves stripped of autonomy. Their lives were not defined by freedom or choice, but by duty, routine, and survival. And yet for most of them, this life did not feel like oppression. It felt like reality. Most Egyptians were peasants, farmers who lived in small villages clustered along the Nile. Their homes were simple, built from mud brick, repaired constantly and easily destroyed by floods or time. Life followed the river's rhythm with almost religious precision. When the Nile rose, fields disappeared under water. When it receded, planting began. Harvest followed months later. Then came taxation, labor duty, and preparation for the next cycle. There was little room for individuality. The river decided the calendar. The state decided obligations. Tradition decided behavior. Life was repetitive, but repetition meant survival. Peasants worked their own plots, but ownership was conditional. Land could be reassigned. Yields were measured, taxes were collected regardless of hardship. Yet many peasants did not think of themselves as exploited. They believed the land existed because order existed, and order existed because authority maintained it. The system taught them that obedience was not submission, but participation. To work was to belong. Life was precarious. A failed flood could mean hunger. Disease was common. Medical knowledge existed, but superstition and prayer played equal roles. Despite this, Egyptians were not constantly miserable. Festivals broke the monotony. Beer and bread were staples. Music, storytelling, and family life offered comfort. Hope did not come from change. It came from continuity. As long as the Nile returned, life went on. Beyond farming, many Egyptians became state workers, builders, quarrymen, canal diggers, craftsmen. Some worked seasonally. Others lived permanently near royal or temple projects. These workers were not slaves in the modern sense. They were fed, housed, and organized by the state. Their labor was compulsory, but also respected. Building monuments was framed as sacred service. To contribute one's strength to eternal structures was an honor. Even exhaustion had meaning. Work assignments were not negotiated. Names were recorded. Attendance was tracked. Absence was punished. The state decided when your body was needed. But because this labor followed predictable cycles and was tied to survival, food rations, protection, status, it was accepted. Freedom was not expected. Stability was. Women in Egypt occupied a complex position. Compared to many ancient societies, they had notable legal rights. They could own property, inherit, and bring cases to court. Yet their daily lives were still shaped by hierarchy and authority. Most women worked within households, grinding grain, baking bread, raising children, weaving cloth. Elite women enjoyed comfort and influence, but common women bore heavy physical labor. Their freedom existed within limits set by tradition and power. Slavery existed, but it was not the foundation of Egypt's economy as it was in later civilizations. Slaves came from war captives, debt, or punishment. They worked in households, temples, workshops, and fields. Their lives were controlled completely by others. Yet even slaves were absorbed into the system rather than excluded. They were fed, they were counted, they were assigned roles. Absolute power preferred control to abandonment. From birth, Egyptians were taught their place. Children learned through imitation, instruction, and discipline. Boys were trained for labor or scribal schools if lucky. Girls learned household skills early. Education reinforced hierarchy. Respect for elders and superiors was drilled into behavior. Obedience was not imposed suddenly. It was grown. Religion was not confined to temples. It was present in homes, fields, and villages. People prayed for health, fertility, protection, and justice. Small household shrines honored gods and ancestors. This personal faith did not challenge authority. It complemented it. The same gods who protected families also protected the throne. Most people did not encounter soldiers or judges daily. Power was present but subtle. Fear came not from constant punishment, but from awareness. Records existed, obligations were tracked. Authority could appear at any time. The possibility of enforcement was enough. Absolute power worked best when unseen. When peasants encountered law, it felt arbitrary. Officials decided outcomes. Records mattered more than testimony. Yet people accepted this. They did not expect fairness. They expected resolution. Justice was something done to them, not for them. Villages relied on cooperation. Neighbors shared tools, labor, and information. The state was distant but ever present. Local life softened its edges. People survived not because they resisted power, but because they adapted to it. Death was constant and meaningful. Egyptians believed life continued beyond the grave. Even common people hoped for judgment, balance, and peace in the afterlife. This belief made suffering bearable. Injustice in life could be corrected after death. Hope existed beyond authority. Why did millions live under absolute power without constant rebellion? Because the system delivered what mattered most: predictability. Life was hard, but understandable. Authority was absolute, but familiar. The alternative, chaos, was worse. The pyramids did not rise on divine will alone. They rose on peasant backs. Temples did not function without daily labor. Bureaucracy did not work without compliance. Absolute power was built from countless small obediences repeated every day. The people beneath the throne were not passive victims. They were the foundation, and as long as they worked, waited, prayed, and endured, absolute power in Egypt did not need to justify itself. It simply existed. For centuries, ancient Egypt projected an image of perfect order, eternal kingship, divine favor, unbroken tradition. Monuments rose, rituals continued, and the Nile flowed on schedule. To the eye and to official records, the system appeared invincible. But beneath the polished stone and sacred language, cracks formed slowly and quietly. Absolute power created stability, but it also created fragility. When the system worked, it worked magnificently. When it failed from the inside. Collapse in Egypt rarely came as sudden revolution. It came as erosion. Egyptian ideology insisted that order was permanent. History was presented as repetition, not progress. Each new reign was framed as a restoration of an ancient perfect balance. But reality was messier. Floods varied. Harvests failed, borders shifted, rulers differed in ability. The system survived these stresses for centuries, but only as long as belief, resources, and authority remained aligned. When one element weakened, strain spread everywhere. Corruption was not an anomaly in Egypt. It was a predictable outcome of absolute power. Officials controlled resources, labor, and justice with little oversight. Temples amassed wealth. Bureaucrats handled records that defined reality. Opportunity bred abuse. Grain disappeared, taxes were inflated, labor demands were manipulated. Local officials enriched themselves while claiming loyalty to order. At first, corruption was tolerated. As long as the system delivered stability, minor injustice was acceptable. But, over time, corruption hollowed out trust. The system began serving itself instead of the people beneath it. Egypt's greatest strength, its bureaucracy, also became a weakness. Procedures multiplied, offices overlapped, authority diffused, officials focused on protecting their positions rather than maintaining balance. Records were altered, reports lied upward. The machinery kept moving, but it no longer served reality. When administration loses contact with lived conditions, power becomes blind. Absolute power depends heavily on the perceived strength of the ruler. When the pharaoh was competent, pious, and victorious, the system held. When he was weak, young, absent, or ineffective, everything trembled. A weak pharaoh could not command the same belief. Rituals continued, but confidence faded. Officials obeyed outwardly while pursuing their own interests. Divinity without authority becomes theater. Transitions of power were especially dangerous. The death of a pharaoh disrupted the illusion of eternal order. Rival claims emerged. Regents ruled in the name of children. Priests and generals maneuvered quietly. The system pretended continuity, but everyone felt uncertainty. If succession failed, legitimacy fractured. And once legitimacy fractured, obedience followed. When floods failed repeatedly, famine followed. Grain stores emptied, redistribution faltered, hunger changes behavior. Peasants who once accepted duty began to question officials. Workers abandoned projects, taxes went unpaid, theft increased. The state that once monopolized survival struggled to provide it. Power that cannot feed loses authority. Egypt did not experience constant uprisings, but unrest appeared in waves. Local revolts, strikes, refusals to work, attacks on officials. These were not ideological rebellions. They were practical. People resisted not because they rejected order, but because order no longer protected them. Rebellion was desperation, not philosophy. One of the clearest signs of internal breakdown was labor unrest. When workers were not paid, fed, or supplied, they stopped working. This was unprecedented. A system built on obedience suddenly faced refusal. Not overthrow, but pause. When labor halted, monuments stopped. And when monuments stopped, the illusion of eternal power cracked. As central authority weakened, temples often filled the vacuum. Priests controlled resources, land, and loyalty. In some periods, religious leaders ruled regions in all but name. The pharaoh remained divine, but distant. Shared authority turned competitive. The throne still existed, but it no longer dominated. When officials grew corrupt and enforcement weakened, law lost its authority. Punishments became inconsistent. Justice felt arbitrary even by Egyptian standards. Fear diminished. Cynicism grew. Once people stop believing punishment restores balance, it becomes meaningless or enraging. One of the most dangerous forces in decline is memory. People remembered periods when the system worked, when floods were good, rulers strong, and order real. Comparison bred dissatisfaction. The past became an accusation against the present. Foreign invasions often followed internal collapse. Enemies sensed weakness. Borders were undermanned, garrisons unpaid. Invaders did not destroy a strong Egypt. They entered a broken one. The collapse began inside long before outsiders arrived. When disasters multiplied, ideology struggled to explain them. Rituals failed to restore order. Prayers went unanswered. Faith did not disappear, but doubt crept in. The most dangerous question emerged. What if obedience no longer works? Even in collapse, Egypt did not vanish. The system bent. Power fragmented. New dynasties rose. Why? Because the ideology was deeper than any ruler. Order was still desired. chaos was still feared. Collapse was not rejection, it was reset. Egypt's history proves a paradox. Absolute power can create extraordinary stability, but it cannot correct itself easily. Without mechanisms for accountability, error accumulates. Without equality, resentment grows. Without flexibility, stress becomes fracture. The system worked best when conditions were favorable, and failed hardest when they were not. Stone monuments still stood. Rituals still echoed. Titles remained grand. But beneath them, trust eroded. And once belief weakens, even gods fall silent. Egypt did not collapse because people hated absolute power. It collapsed when absolute power stopped delivering what it promised. Order, survival, meaning. When those failed, obedience became habit without hope, and habit alone cannot hold a civilization together forever. For more than 3,000 years, ancient Egypt stood as one of the most enduring political systems in human history. Dynasties rose and fell, foreign invaders came and went, and yet the core structure of power, divine kingship, sacred order, centralized control, survived longer than almost any other civilization. Absolute power in Egypt did not collapse quickly, violently, or completely. It eroded slowly, unevenly, and reluctantly. Egypt did not fall because absolute power was weak. It fell because absolute power could not change fast enough. To understand Egypt's fall, one must first understand why it lasted so long. Absolute power in Egypt was not maintained by terror alone. It was supported by belief, ritual, habit, and necessity. The pharaoh was divine. Order was sacred. Obedience was moral. Survival depended on participation in the system. This created a civilization that valued continuity over innovation, stability over freedom, and tradition over reform. For centuries, this worked remarkably well. When floods came reliably, when borders were secure, and when rulers were competent, the system felt perfect. That perfection became Egypt's greatest weakness. Egypt's political ideology was designed to freeze time. The goal was not progress, but repetition, each reign restoring an ideal past that never truly existed. This mindset discouraged experimentation. New ideas were viewed with suspicion. Change was associated with chaos. Reform implied imbalance. As the world around Egypt evolved, new technologies, new military tactics, new economic systems, Egypt remained deeply committed to what had always worked before. Absolute power ensured stability. It did not ensure flexibility. Every aspect of Egyptian governance was bound to tradition. Rituals had to be performed exactly. Titles had to be inherited. Symbols had to remain unchanged. Even when circumstances demanded reform, ideology resisted it. Rulers who tried to centralize power differently, reform religion, or alter economic structures faced resistance, not just from elites, but from belief itself. To change the system felt like an attack on the universe. Eventually, tradition became a cage. One of the most revealing aspects of Egypt's decline is that foreign rulers often adopted Egyptian traditions rather than abolishing them. Conquerors presented themselves as pharaohs, performed rituals, and upheld temples. Why? Because the system still worked psychologically. People obeyed because the symbols remained. The language of power endured even when power itself had changed hands. This adaptability allowed Egypt to survive occupation, but it also hollowed authority from within. The throne remained sacred, but increasingly disconnected from real control. As foreign influence increased, Egypt lost true independence while retaining its rituals. Decisions were made elsewhere. Resources flowed outward. The pharaoh still ruled in theory, but not in practice. Absolute power survived symbolically long after it failed politically. Centuries of monumental building, temple expansion, and elite privilege drained resources. Corruption diverted wealth. Famine exposed fragility. The state that once monopolized survival struggled to meet basic needs. When absolute power cannot provide stability, it loses its justification. The most dangerous moment for any system built on belief is when people continue obeying, but stop believing. Rituals continued, titles remained, laws were enforced, but faith in the system's ability to protect, provide, and balance the world weakened. Obedience became habit rather than conviction, and habit alone is fragile. Egypt's army, once dominant, struggled to match foreign powers with superior weapons, tactics, and organization. Chariots, fortifications, and discipline were no longer enough. Victory, once proof of divine favor, became uncertain. When the gods seemed to lose battles, belief faltered. Ironically, as Egypt declined, authority became more centralized in theory and more fragmented in reality. Officials acted independently, priests governed regions, military leaders gained influence. The system that once unified everything could no longer coordinate itself. Absolute power requires coherence. Egypt lost it. Egypt did not end in fire and revolution. It transformed. Its gods were reinterpreted, its temples repurposed, its language faded, its rituals lost urgency. What remained was culture without sovereignty, memory without authority. The system did not explode. It dissolved. Egypt's system failed not because it was cruel, nor because people demanded freedom. It failed because it could not evolve. A system that defines change as chaos cannot survive a changing world forever. Yet failure does not erase achievement. Egypt proved that absolute power, when fused with belief, environment, and administration, can endure longer than almost any political system in history. Its influence shaped empires that came after. Its symbols still command awe. Its monuments still dominate the landscape. Even in failure, Egypt speaks. Absolute power can create order, meaning, and stability, but when power cannot question itself, correct itself, or adapt itself, it becomes fragile beneath its appearance of strength. Egypt's rulers believed they ruled forever. They were wrong, but they ruled longer than almost anyone else ever has. And that paradox, the triumph and failure of absolute power, remains Egypt's greatest legacy.